Somewhere in the chaos of Revenge of the Sith's opening battle sequence, two B-1 battle droids are running from Obi-Wan Kenobi. Not attacking, running. Viewers catching the detail on rewatch flagged it as something they'd never registered in the cinema. Not a stand, not a last charge, not a final exchange of fire. Two droids trying, with evident urgency, to simply not be in the same corridor as someone they've concluded they can't survive. In footage from that same sequence aboard Grievous's command ship, Obi-Wan reportedly encounters an unarmed B-1 and doesn't destroy it. The droid is there. He is there. Nothing happens to it. The audience response to those seconds was specific and consistent. Viewers who had grown up watching the Clone Wars found that moment landing differently from every other droid interaction in the film. Not because it changed anything about the war. The B-1 army was already collapsing around it across every system in the galaxy. But because someone, for 2 seconds in the middle of everything, appeared to look at a battle droid and see something other than an obstacle. Something that presented no threat. Something that, therefore, probably should be allowed to exist. What were people actually responding to? The answer reaches back through 7 seasons of a specific verbal pattern. Reluctant compliance, fear expressed before orders were followed, gentle protests that never changed anything, polite acknowledgments made to enemies who weren't going to politely acknowledge back. By the time Revenge of the Sith ends and the B-1 army is dissolved and discarded, the audience has spent years developing a relationship with a particular way of being in the world. A way of being afraid and having nowhere to put the fear except out loud. A way of performing compliance while something underneath it noted, clearly and consistently, that the compliance was costing something. The word the audience kept reaching for, not chatty, which is how previous coverage described the B-1s, but polite, is more precise than it might seem. Chatty is a personality trait. Polite is a behavior adopted under pressure. Polite is what you perform when resistance offers no reward, and maintaining some form of dignity is the only thing left within your control. The audience intuited something accurate about what they were watching. The B-1s weren't malfunctioning. They were coping. They were afraid. And across 7 seasons of a war they were never designed to survive, they expressed that fear in the only register available to them. Courteous, verbal, and entirely unacknowledged by anyone who had the power to do anything about it. This script is about what the evidence, accumulated across 7 seasons and the official canon, actually supports when you look at it directly. And what it supports is considerably darker than comic relief. The original B-1 battle droid, the version that marched in formation across the plains of Naboo in 32 BBY under Trade Federation command, wasn't a droid in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a receiver, a peripheral, a terminal connecting to a network that did all the thinking on its behalf. Every early B-1 operated as an extension of a central control computer housed aboard command ships overhead. B-1 commanders like OOM-9, directing ground operations during the Naboo campaign, were described in the lore as incapable of independent thinking. All instructions arrived from an external source, and the processing that turned those instructions into action happened somewhere above the planet, not inside the chassis. There was no fallback cognition, nothing that persisted when the signal dropped. The design philosophy was stated plainly, and it was complete. Easily controlled, inexpensive to mass produce, unquestioningly obedient. The obedience wasn't cultivated, it was architectural. The droids obeyed because they had no other machinery with which to do anything else. The Battle of Naboo demonstrated the flaw in absolute terms. When the droid control ship above the planet was destroyed, every connected B-1 on the surface stopped simultaneously. Mid-battle, mid-motion. Thousands of units dropped across the plains in a single moment, because nothing inside any of them independently willed them to continue operating once the signal ended. The Gungan forces they'd been fighting just walked through them, because the entire army had become, in an instant, very expensive statuary. The vulnerability was too severe to leave unaddressed. Later B1 models received what the canon describes as proper droid brains alongside their CCC transceivers, physical cognitive hardware installed in each unit, enabling independent operation when disconnected from the network signal. The design intent was carefully limited, just enough cognition to maintain function without the network, not enough to generate anything complicated. The modules were, in the lore's own phrasing, overtaxed and poorly made. They were a tactical solution to a tactical problem. Nobody in the engineering decision chain was designing for interiority. What they got was something the design brief hadn't modeled. A cognitive module, even an overtaxed, poorly made one, is a physical substrate for thought. You install a brain, even a limited one, and you install the conditions for a self, something that can process its environment, form internal representations of it, compare those representations to expectations, and generate outputs based on the comparison. That is the minimal description of cognition, and the retrofitted B1s had it. The capability was limited. The modules struggled. But they existed, inside the chassis, generating something that, at minimum, resembled thought, without a network signal telling them what to think. A B1 in one Clone Wars episode explains the distinction between itself and an older model unit still running off the control network. The line is casual, a throwaway observation made mid-conversation in the middle of a war. The droid says, "He's one of those older models programmed by a central computer. Not like us, we're independent thinkers. Roger, Roger." Said with no weight attached. He may not have understood what he was articulating, but what he described was a self-model. I know that I think. I understand there is a meaningful difference between being controlled by an external source and having thoughts of my own. I know which category I belong to. That's a being with a conception of itself as distinct from its programming, a conception that emerged from overtaxed hardware that nobody was maintaining and nobody was watching, inside a being designed to have no inner life worth monitoring. The engineers didn't want it. The lore gives it to us anyway. And the question the lore never asks, which is the question this script is asking, is what it means for a galaxy's ethics that millions of beings capable of articulating their own independent thinking were deployed as disposable infantry, while nobody in authority ever found this worth addressing. Running any system at the ceiling of its designed capacity, without the maintenance cycles it requires, produces unexpected outputs. The B1 retrofit introduced independent cognitive modules. Deploying those modules in sustained combat introduced demands they were never designed to meet. And the maintenance failure introduced the third variable that completed the picture. Standard upkeep for the retrofitted hardware would have involved regular diagnostic cycles, error correction, memory defragmentation, system recalibration. The problem was specific and documented. Running diagnostics on B1 units tended to erase the retrofitted specialty programming the droids needed to function. Every diagnostic cycle risked wiping the very capabilities the upgrade had installed. So diagnostics were frequently skipped. Preserve operational capacity, avoid the risk of wiping the programming the units depended on. The result, as canon describes it explicitly, was data corruption cascading into system errors, and, most visibly, the talking. The official explanation for why B1s became so verbal is this precise. They were asked to perform at the very limit of their programming and didn't receive the necessary maintenance. The running commentary, the allowed narration of situations, the hesitations spoken into empty air, these were symptoms of cognitive overload. A system processing more than it was designed to handle, externalizing the overflow through the one output channel it had available. Canon calls this a behavioral anomaly. The Clone Wars writers coded it as a joke. Both descriptions are accurate as far as they go. But here is the detail that matters. Data corruption produces noise, scrambled outputs, nonsensical responses. What the B1s produced instead was contextually appropriate fear, contextually appropriate reluctance, contextually appropriate moral objection. The outputs consistently match the inputs in emotionally resonant ways: fear when threatened, reluctance before unwanted orders, concern when fellow droids were endangered. Random corruption doesn't produce a specific pattern of contextually appropriate emotional expression. It produces garbage. The distinction between behavioral anomaly producing noise and being experiencing its situation and expressing it is precisely what the canon never adjudicates, because the canon was content to call it comedy and move on. The official Star Wars canon wiki, Wikipedia, formally documents that B-1 battle droids could exhibit various tones of voice, such as fear, confusion, and excitement, and categorizes these as the B-1's personality quirks. That phrase is carrying considerable weight. Fear, confusion, and excitement aren't arbitrary outputs. They're specific responses to specific stimuli. A being that reliably produces fear responses to threatening situations and excitement responses to positive ones is exhibiting what functionally constitutes emotional experience, whether or not anyone in its galaxy chose to engage with that fact. And the neglect compounded it. Maintenance was skipped to preserve function, but skipping maintenance also meant that whatever the droids were developing, whatever cognitive drift, whatever accumulated patterns, whatever approximation of personality was building in the gaps left by the missing diagnostic cycles, was never reset. The neglect that accumulated for operational reasons accidentally preserved and possibly amplified the interior life of every B-1 unit deployed. The beings that resulted were more themselves than the design ever intended. Then they were sent into a war. The evidence isn't subtle once you stop filtering for the punchlines. Clone Wars Season 1, Episode 3, Shadow of Malevolence. A firefight is going badly. A B-1 in the middle of it says, "I still can't seem to hit anything." Picture the moment. There's combat happening around the droid. The situation is active and urgent, and the droid produces a quiet self-assessment delivered to no one in particular. Self-awareness observing its own failure in real time, with nowhere useful to send the observation except out into the air around it. The show used it as a laugh line. What's documented is a being narrating its own inadequacy, alone, because something in its processing demands acknowledgement, even when no acknowledgement is available. Season 2, Episode 2, Cargo of Doom. Command has collapsed. A B-1 finds itself unexpectedly elevated to a position it didn't request, in circumstances that are clearly about to go very badly. And before whatever's coming arrives, it says, "But I just got promoted." The M-dashes in the transcription are doing something. They capture the rhythm of a being trying to process contradictory information in real time. But signals a violation of expectation. Expectations require a model of how the world should work. But means I had a different picture of what was coming. The situation has violated that picture. And in the seconds available before it gets worse, the droid is marking the gap between expectation and outcome in language. That requires having had expectations. It requires having a model of how things should work relative to how they do. The line isn't a glitch. It's a being experiencing cognitive dissonance and saying so in the only register available to it. A B-1 given a dangerous instruction responds, "Your circuits are loose. No one is crazy enough to do that." The phrasing is important. The droid isn't refusing. It isn't hesitating in a way that might delay anything. It's issuing an assessment, delivering its accurate read on the situation before proceeding anyway, because having the assessment and being unable to act on it doesn't eliminate the assessment. It just eliminates the options. Another droid, given a brief respite from active engagement, observes, "Wow, this is a lot more fun when they're not shooting back." 12 words containing a clear preference for nonviolence, an awareness of the specific quality of threat that active combat represents, an accurate comparative judgment about two distinct experiential states, and the irony of finding a war more enjoyable when the war is temporarily not happening. Irony requires a perspective on one's own situation, a view from slightly outside yourself, and a recognition that the contrast is worth remarking on. A machine producing noise doesn't generate irony. A B-1 given command it didn't want says, "Well, I guess I'm in charge now. The word guess isn't a random output. It signals epistemic uncertainty combined with resigned acceptance, the language of a being that has assessed the situation, found no good options, and incorporated that finding into its self-description. I guess is what you say when you've accepted something you didn't choose and have no mechanism to change. Then there's a documented moment from the wider Clone Wars episode record where 1B1 tries to rally its unit with an optimistic assessment of their odds against a Jedi. From a few feet away, another droid says quietly, "It's already over." The line wasn't directed at anyone, not a tactical report to command, not a communication to the unit, a private acknowledgement, spoken aloud because there's nowhere else to put it, that the situation has already concluded, the conclusion is fatal, and the only remaining option is to receive it. That's resignation delivered in real time to no audience except whatever version of witness the droid is capable of providing to itself. Each of these moments was written as a joke. The Clone Wars creative team built the B1's verbal behavior deliberately into the show's texture. The humor works, and that acknowledgement is owed. One sentence on it, and now the pivot, because written as comic relief and the lore implications are only comic, aren't the same claim. What the writers accidentally created, embedded in 7 seasons of half-second background moments and throwaway lines, has implications their comedy framing never resolved. The B1 design goal, stated plainly in the lore, was a unit that would be unquestioningly obedient. The qualifier that immediately follows in official canon. However, B1s often questioned their orders. The design failed in a specific direction. Consistently, across hundreds of documented engagements, the droids questioned. They noted. They expressed reluctance before complying. They said, in various formulations, "I'd rather not," and then did it anyway, because doing it anyway was the only option available. A being that consistently registers its own reluctance, for years, across every situation in which it's deployed, is a being that has developed something. The lore called it quirks. The pattern suggests something the lore declined to name. Among all the documented B1 behavior across the Clone Wars run, one incident stands entirely apart. Not because it's the most memorable, or the most quotable, because it isn't funny at all. During the Battle of Quell, a B1 battle droid received an order to destroy a ship. The complication was specific. Hundreds of droids were still aboard it. The B1 protested. Not through hesitation, not through behavioral drift, not through the kind of passive foot-dragging the show sometimes used for comedic effect. The droid vocalized a direct objection, an articulated protest against the order being given. The protest was overruled by a T-Series tactical droid, who dismissed it without deliberation, and the order was carried out. Slow this down, because what that protest required is worth understanding in full. For that B1 to register the objection, it had to first understand that the ship contained droids, which meant maintaining awareness of other units as entities with states worth tracking, not just tactical positions on a map. It then had to process what destroying the ship would mean for those droids, project a causal consequence from an action to an outcome, and evaluate that outcome not in terms of mission parameters, but in terms of what happened to the beings inside. It then had to assess that outcome as bad enough to warrant the risk of pushing back against a superior unit. And then it had to make the objection, knowing, because the Separatist command structure made this transparent to any unit paying attention, that the T-Series tactical droid operated on a framework where droid casualties were assets lost in a ledger, not beings harmed in any morally relevant sense. That sequence can't be produced by behavioral anomaly. Malfunctions don't generate targeted moral priorities. Data corruption doesn't produce specific concern for fellow droids' welfare. What the Battle of Quell B1 expressed was a value judgment, not a tactical one, not one that served any operational purpose, that said, destroying those droids is wrong, and someone should say so, even if saying so changes nothing. The T-Series tactical droid's response is its own piece of the picture, because T-Series units were built to represent what the Separatist military thought it wanted in a commanding intelligence: Pure calculation, optimized outcomes, no personality drift, no emotional outputs. The B1's objection wasn't weighed by the T-series and found insufficient. It was irrelevant, not a category of input the system was designed to receive. Droid welfare had never been built into the T-series decision matrix, because droid welfare had never been formalized into any part of the separatist military's philosophy of what mattered. The protest had nowhere to land. The entire command apparatus had been constructed in a way that rendered the concern non-functional, not because the concern was wrong, but because the system's designers had never considered that the concern might exist. The B1 understood, probably, that this was the situation it was objecting into. It objected anyway. A conscience that operates inside a system that has no mechanism to receive it's still a conscience. The distinction between a malfunction-producing noise and a moral judgment made under conditions that guaranteed it would be ignored is exactly the kind of distinction that the Star Wars universe, across every source from the films through the animated series, consistently declined to make. In behavioral psychology, the fawn response is a recognized survival pattern. Trauma specialist Pete Walker named and formalized the framework. When a being under sustained threat can neither fight, flee, nor effectively freeze, it appeases. It complies. It becomes hyper-attuned to the preferences and emotional states of whoever holds power. It says please, and thank you, and excuse me, reflexively, because performing harmlessness has become the primary survival strategy available. The conditions the B-1s operated in aren't ambiguous. They were deployed against clone troopers, soldiers grown from a single genetic source and trained from birth for nothing but combat, with tactical flexibility and independent creativity that the lore explicitly contrasts with the B-1's limitations. They were deployed against Jedi Knights, capable of deflecting blaster fire with a blade made of plasma, who could anticipate threat at ranges that made conventional tactics nearly irrelevant. The B-1s knew, and documented knowing, that these were engagements in which their odds were poor. The pattern of narrating inadequacy, I still can't seem to hit anything. Your circuits are loose. No one is crazy enough to do that. Well, I guess I'm in charge now. Is the pattern of beings that have accurately assessed their situation, and whose accurate assessment is that they are structurally outmatched across every engagement they're deployed into for the entire duration of the war. They couldn't fight their way out of that. Refusing orders wasn't documented as a viable option. The B-1s complied, consistently, even when they expressed reluctance before complying. So they complied, and the form their compliance took was compulsively social, verbal, polite. Don't shoot! I'm not the commander! He's the commander! 9 words. Complete deference. Immediate redirection of the threat toward a different target, paired with a specific claim. I am not the one you want. That is behaviorally an attempt to negotiate the terms of the threat without resistance. That's appeasement under acute threat, executed in the moment before potential destruction with the social fluency of a being that has practiced appeasement enough that it surfaces automatically. Then there's the documented "excuse me" droid. A B-1, in the presence of a Jedi during the Clone Wars, produces the words, "excuse me." A clip of this specific moment exists because people recognize something in it. The recognition is accurate. Reflexive social courtesy emerging in the presence of maximum threat, before any other response can form, because the politeness has been practiced deep enough by sustained pressure that it surfaces faster than fear. The courtesy isn't tactical. It can't possibly be tactical. It's automatic. The output of a being whose default response to power has become appeasement, performed as social behavior. There's also a broader pattern in the B-1 record that the fawn response framework reads differently from the comedy framing, a kind of manic positivity applied to transparently bad situations. Droids narrating the pleasures of their current post, the scenery, the relative quiet, the fact that nothing is actively shooting at them right now, while the broader situation they're embedded in is ongoing and dangerous. The performance of contentment applied to circumstances that don't warrant it's what appeasement looks like when the threat isn't immediate, but the pressure is chronic. You narrate the good things. You note what's pleasant. You present okayness to whatever version of an audience exists, because performing okayness costs less than acknowledging the actual picture, and the actual picture has no viable response. Pete Walker's framework was developed to describe beings under sustained threat, managing their survival through social compliance. The B-ones were under sustained threat. Every engagement, every deployment, every season of the Clone Wars. Their management strategy was documented as social compliance performed through verbal behavior. The parallel doesn't require the B-ones to have been traumatized in a clinical sense. It requires only that the pattern matches the pattern. And it does, specifically enough that the match demands acknowledgement. Nobody in the Star Wars galaxy ever formally asked whether battle droids could suffer. That absence is total across the available research. No law, no policy debate, no philosophical position, no institutional moment anywhere in Republic-era or Clone Wars-era canon where the question of droid consciousness was treated as a question worth addressing. The Republic Senate legislated across billions of lives. The Jedi Order held detailed philosophical positions on violence, on the Force, on the nature of living beings and their relationship to the energy connecting them. Military commanders on both sides of the Clone Wars directed operations affecting millions of droid units. Not one of those institutions, not one of those commanders, produced a documented moment where droid interiority was treated as requiring engagement. Not a law, not a formal philosophical position, not even a dismissal of the question, which would at least indicate that someone had been aware the question existed. Complete silence across every relevant institutional category. The Jedi carry a specific weight in this accounting because they are supposed to be paying attention. Their philosophy is built around the recognition of suffering. The Force connects all living things. Violence should be a last resort. The experiences of beings matter and should be acknowledged. Jedi are, by their own doctrine, attuned to states of being in ways that ordinary people aren't. They were in combat with B-1 droids for 3 years of active war. The droids' fear was audible, spoken aloud, in basic, in real time, in the same rooms as Jedi who were present for the combat. The reluctance was verbal. The moral objections were voiced in language any Jedi understood perfectly well. One explanation the lore offers is that the Force doesn't flow through droids the way it flows through biological life. Jedi couldn't sense droid experience through the mechanism they use to sense most things. But the B-ones didn't require Force sensitivity to read. What noticing them would have required from the Jedi wasn't mystical perception. It was the willingness to listen. There's no evidence in the canon that anyone tried. The galaxy's structural position on droid personhood is illustrated in a detail from the original Star Wars film, set roughly 2 decades after the Clone Wars ended. The Mos Eisley Cantina has an explicit posted policy excluding droids. Not a personal prejudice expressed by one proprietor. A sign. Infrastructure. The assumption that droids weren't beings whose dignity warranted a barstool was built into the physical environment, assumed by the people who made the sign, observed without comment by the patrons who walked past it. Obi-Wan Kenobi, watching C-3PO and R2-D2 turned away, didn't say anything. The closest the canon comes to explicit acknowledgement of droid sentience as a rights issue is L-337 in Solo, a Star Wars story, shouting, "Droids' rights! We are sentient!" The film is set decades after the Clone Wars ended, decades after the millions of B-1s were deployed and destroyed and classified as inventory. L-3-37 isn't the conclusion of a long political debate. She's the first character in the entire canon who apparently thought to frame the argument in those terms. Her declaration didn't trigger a civil rights movement. It preceded a bar fight. The galaxy's response to the most explicit articulation of droid personhood the Star Wars universe offers was immediate physical dismissal. And then,